This is Phantom Electric Ghost, and we're live on the air for the first time with Cindy Ingram, author, and you're a writer, and you're a podcaster as well. So
Yep.
maybe you can give folks a little bit of background. Before we do that, though, we have to mention that we are a featured podcast on Newsly. You can see scrolling below. There's a coupon code. You can try that out for free for a month if you use coupon code GHOST. And as I said, we are a featured podcast on that audio only platform. So we'll be on there later tonight. So thank you again for being on the podcast. How are you doing tonight?
Thank you. I'm excited to be here. I'm doing good. Thanks.
Now, the other thing that we wanted to bring up is the topic that we're going to talk about today is how to look at art for self-discovery, rediscovery. And then we also have, I believe, your website, which is art art is about being whole.com. And that will be
Yep.
fully clickable when we're published. And that will allow
Great.
people to check that out, um, as a further details of what we're going to discuss tonight. That's fully clickable. We do encourage people to click the URLs of the guests that we talk to. So
Awesome.
maybe you can give a little bit of background as a writer, artist, poet, podcaster, educator, and entrepreneur. Maybe you can talk about that.
Yes, I'll try to give you the short version. I can get a little long-winded about it. But yeah, I'm a former art teacher and a former museum educator. And then about 10 years ago, I noticed a big lack of resources in the art teacher world for teaching with works of art, like looking at art and connecting with it and how to do that with your students. And so I developed a business called Art Class Curator, which helps art teachers connect their students with works of art. And I've been doing that, like I said, for almost 10 years. But in the last couple of years, I started to really notice that the way I connect with art is something kind of special and something different. And it's not something that people talk about all that much, but throughout my entire life, anytime I've been with art in an art museum, or even it's before I knew museums existed, it was like in Disney movies and things like that. But I had these really powerful connections that were not about learning about the art. It was about learning about myself. It was about giving me a safe place to feel my feelings, all this sort of thing. So in the last couple of years, I started to really think about what that is and what that's all about. And what that ended up with is my new book, which is called Art is About Being Whole, which is right here. Just came out last week. And it's a memoir told with art. So each chapter is a work of art. That I picked a work of art that I interpret as a tool to move the narrative forward and tell my story at the same time as sort of interpreting the work of art. And then also in the last few years, my degree is in art history. I've always loved looking at art and talking about art. But I hadn't made art since I was really in college. And so in the last 2 years, I started making art again and writing poetry again for the first time since I was a lot younger. And that has just changed my life too. The book chronicles that journey as well. But the journey in the book is mainly about my mental health. I used to be very anxious and very filled with shame and all the things, and then have kind of healed through my interactions with art. So I think that's it.
Well, I think that's always I started this podcast talking to artists. We started talking to musicians back in 2016. We
Mhm.
actually episode like 1009.
Wow.
So we've been around for a little bit since 2016, and the
Yeah.
whole idea, being an artist myself, I'm a synthesist, I'm a keyboardist, I'm a producer,
Mhm.
is a lot of people, don't feel they have the right to actually create art. A
Yep.
lot of people feel like, well, if I can't be Picasso, if I can't be Hendrix, if I can't be Jimmy Page, then I can't do it. But the whole
Yep.
thing as a producer, what I like to tell people is I want to hear the song that you're scared to show somebody, because I think that
Yes.
is going to show me your authentic self. And, everybody can clone whatever's in the top 50, right? But if I can see something that's different, that to me is what I've always gone after. I've always gone after people who are independent, emerging songwriters and artists, because I think everybody has that creative spark. but sometimes
Yeah.
because of like limiting beliefs or they didn't think they were good enough, they can't get to it. And then they
Yeah, and
usually
that
have some kind of issue. They break through and they say, "Oh, I should do it."
yeah. Yeah, we all have these, like, art wounds, and they come to us in various forms from teachers or from society or from whatever, and I actually remember one of the moments that made me be like, "Oh, I'm not good enough for this," and it was my college drawing class. As an art history major, I had to take 4 studio art classes, and I had to take drawing, and I loved it. It was just, you got to sit and draw for 3 hours, and I was covered in charcoal at the end, and at the end of my course, we had to do like a critique of all of our work, and so I had all my drawings out, and I was out in the hallway with my professor, and he was like, "You're the hardest working student in here," and I was like, "Yeah, I do. I tried really hard," but then he gave me a B, and I was like, "Okay." So I tried my very hardest. I did everything I could to do the best I could, but I just didn't have like I just wasn't as good as some of the other people who didn't have to try hard. And so, it was just, I was like, okay, well, I'm not good enough. I'm not creative enough. I don't have enough ideas. And then I study all this art history. And I can imagine if you're listening to all the great musicians, you're like, there's no way I can compete with that. And so then it became this like, this is how artists should be. And I'm over here and I'm not like that. So therefore, I can't be an artist. And that has been a really big process of like deconstructing that over the last couple of years of like, oh, yes, I can, um, and how it was really scary to do.
Well, I think the problem I find is everybody's into perfection. I'm a child of the '70s,
Yes.
and one of the things that kind of is a big equalizer, but it's also a problem is the use of computers, especially
Mm,
with musicians. The use of digital audio workstations or DAWs. And what happens with those is people can spend a lot of time trying to create something they call perfect.
yeah.
And I always try to point out to people, if you go listen to stuff from the '30s or the '50s and the '60s, and you listen to it with a producer's ear, there's all these mistakes. There's tons of microtonal rhythm mistakes. There's cutout mistakes, but those songs are not perfect, but they are what they are. And a lot
Well, and
about
that gives it
art
its
is imperfection,
humanity.
or what
Yeah.
we call the happy accident.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That gives it its
it's
humanity,
a
its
yeah, it becomes
rawness.
authentic.
Yeah.
Yeah,
The art I like
and
to
some
look
people
at is the ones
confuse
that's, yeah. Yeah.
that perfection that's the only way you can do it. But if you think about like Keith Richards, he was never about perfection, right?
Mhm.
And Bob Dylan didn't have perfect pitch. So, Lou Reed doesn't have a singing voice. So
Yeah.
there are people who were able to put themselves in positions that wouldn't have happened, but they had
Yeah.
to kind of push it because they were breaking rules. So there's always the canon, and then the people who kind of push to the kind of outer limit and they get themselves there. And it's hard because the most of the people want what was done before. They
Yeah.
want something that's in the canon. They can't handle something that's outside of it. And a lot of times, art that comes is like it's every individual has a different point of view. And so it's
Yeah.
like if you just clone and copy, like well, you're never gonna get anything original. And
Yeah.
I've always been a big promoter of it. Like, why can't you do it? And a lot of people who would feel that aren't artists, they're very good and they should be seen. And that's my goal is have people get seen.
Yeah. Yeah, I was talking to I'm taking an art class, just at a local community art center, and, um, one of the teacher said something really fascinating, which I never thought about before, but she was like, "You're always your worst critic of your own style." Like, if you have a style, you just don't recognize it. You just see it as flawed. It's just not perfect. It's not like what someone else you've seen, but it's like someone else looking at it is like, "Oh, that's your style. That's what's good about you." And I started to think about that and I'm like, "Oh, that's really that's really fascinating that someone could look at my style and be like, "Oh, that's really cool." But when, you look at your own work and it's hard to see past your insecurities.
Well, it's like kind of about the self-discovery that you mentioned, like in your points, is like
Yeah.
if you use art, like I use art as like therapy. It's like, it's a
Yes.
catharsis. I write all the
Yeah.
time. I'm in my home studio. I put things down and I kind of throw them at the wall. I throw them at SoundCloud. I put demos out and let my fans decide what they like. And then there's sometimes
Mm,
that pushes what I put out. But I don't, I kind of have this throw it at the wall. And a lot of people are like, oh, I can't
yeah.
do that. But if you don't show people what you can do, you start to get fans all over the world because of the way the world is now with the net. That if you put your work out and you're not as self critical, you'll find that you start to, like a law of attraction, people come to you, producers
Mhm.
come to you, other musicians come to you, other artists come to you because they see something that you didn't see. Because you're so self-limiting, most artists, that they won't
Yeah.
show people their best work because they're comparing it to somebody else's work.
Yeah. And it's fascinating too, because we always see the end result. Like we read the book that happens at the end. We hear the song that's been perfectly mastered and layered, and we see the artwork that's hanging in the museum, but we don't see like all the stuff that led up to that. And like that's what's so cool about the internet. But like I was at the Prado Museum, no, not the Prado, the Reina Sofia Museum in Madrid, that where Picasso's Guernica is, that big giant one he did about the bombing of that town, Guernica. And all in the around the same room is like his sketches and paintings that he did in preparation for that.
Yeah,
And
prep.
they're even more emotional than the actual painting was. And then you get into it and you see all the drips and you see all, like, you can see what he did before and you paint it over it. And it's like, we sometimes we'll see the end result, but we don't see like all
Yeah,
of the
and so
work that you had to put into it to get it to that place.
and that's the
Um,
cool thing about the net today is that, like,
yeah.
there are a lot of artists that will put their demos out, put their rehearsals out, and people get a window. Like, if you open up the opportunities, like, as I've seen a lot of musicians, like, actually have documentaries of them putting together their piece of work.
Mhm.
So people get to see that kind of process. And fans usually are, like, very welcoming of, like, I do wanna know about that. They do wanna see that. They do wanna
Yeah.
go buy the big collection that has all the versions that came before the one that you actually put out. And
Yeah.
there's people who go looking for those archives, and they go
Yeah.
looking for that, within jazz and almost every form of music, people want to see the archives, like,
Well,
of
and two,
what.
like, yeah, our artists are human, and so like we and that is seeing all of that like connects you to their humanity. It connects you to like who they are as people. Then it takes them off this pedestal and puts them kind of closer to you, and then you're able to connect with it on a deeper level because you're seeing that person's humanity. And I think that's what's so magic about the connection to art that is possible, is when the humanity of the artwork or the song or whatever it is meets the humanity of the person that's listening to it, viewing it, watching, whatever it is. And like there's really some powerful things that can happen in that space.
Yeah, because the creative process, like, what it teaches us about life is,
Mhm.
like, I was listening to Herbie Hancock, and he had this statement. He was working with Miles Davis, and he made a mistake in a live performance, and he thought it was gonna be like the end because he was new.
Yeah.
He was one of the new people that was working with Miles, and he thought, "Well, Miles is gonna kick me out." And Miles actually changed the song to match his
Mm,
chord change. And he said, he taught him a lesson in terms of, you know what, I can live in the present. I can learn to react to what is happening right now, not what I perceive what should have happened. And so instead of
yes.
trying to be a slave to the notes on the page, actually embrace what is actually going on. And Miles said that's how you create new music. That's how you create, how we went from bebop to fusion, because I was
Yeah.
willing to go against what was the normal canon. And jazz was bebop. And then he went to fusion. And everybody said, "Oh, you're doing something totally wrong." Well, it's not wrong to actually want to go try something different.
Yeah. And that's like when I
The
started
life
making
is like
art
you don't
again.
have to stay in your lane.
Right. Yeah. When
Yeah,
I started
go ahead.
making art again, it was like that. It was like my whole life has been about up until recent, like maybe like the last 5 to 10 years, has been about like trying to be perfect. It's been about like being assumed to be put together, being the smartest, all this stuff. And I have been highly ambitious. I'm like, I'm running this business. I'm like, I want to make this $1 million business, and I'm going to do this, and I'm going to reach this many people. I'm like all these goals and all these future and I was never actually like present for any of it. And then once I started to make art again, it like brought me back to my body and into myself and into the presence. And it's like, oh, okay, well, I'm just making art. So I put blue down. I'm like, wait, well, what looks like it would go good next? And then I would just pick whatever go. It's like it allowed me to like be present, to tap into my intuition, to like not think about what the final product would be. Because what I realized is that I can't do that. If I start with what I want it to be like in mind, I can't do it. I have to just let it happen. And that has been a huge lesson when it's like against my entire life of ambition, but I feel so much more like present and content and, I don't know, whole, and everything.
Yeah, it's the kind of wholeness is like what I found is I'm a big fan of Victorian poets, like getting into Blake and Wordsworth and Tennyson,
Yeah.
Lord Byron, and the whole idea is the idea of the muse. The idea, like a lot of artists will say, you know what, I kind of feel the universe, and people say, what's that? That's kind of foo-foo hippie. But it is like a lot of artists, when you let go of your set construction, right, of a song, you might have
Yeah.
had a set idea. Then you get with a bunch of other guys or whoever you're playing with, and you allow it to happen, which means you don't get really like it has to be like this. It has to be like what you are really originally intended. But if you actually go in with an open mind and say, you know what, the drummer has a different idea, the bass player has a different idea, the saxophone has, if you're willing to accept some of that and allow it to be like in that present moment, then you actually enjoy that time rather than obsessing and make everybody redo it, redo it, redo it. Then nobody likes it. Then
Yeah.
it's not as fun. It doesn't feel as organic. It feels kind of forced. Like if something
Yeah.
feels forced, then it doesn't kind of flow. It's not in like flow state. It's kind
Yeah.
of
And the
like
energy makes its way in like that forced energy comes through to the listener or the viewer. Like that exact same thing happened when I was writing this book. I started out, it was more like a teachery kind of book. It was very explanatory. It was very much like I'm gonna use research and tell you why you should look at art this way, and here's all the reasons, and this is what science says, and all this stuff. And yes, I started working with a coach, and we realized that there was two books I was writing. There was this really highly personal one that told my story, and then there was this like teachery kind of explaining one. And that was the part that was being forced as I was trying to I think convince people that the personal stuff was okay to include, like that, and I was trying to like not get criticized. There's all this stuff that was like coming from a weird place. And then once I cut half of the book, I had already written 50,000 words. I cut half of it out and then just went full force on the memoir. That's when like the process really where I was in that flow state. And that's when like I was reading a book and like there was something. One story was like I was reading that book, Remarkably Bright Creatures, and there was a line in the book about a shark that can't the sharks can't have to keep swimming or they can't breathe, and the character was like, I understand what it's like to not to keep moving. And so I was like, oh, I recognize that too. And so and at that same time I was writing a chapter about burnout, and I was like, whoa, wow, that's exactly what I'm writing about right now. And I was trying to pick an artwork for the chapter, and I kept having a bunch of false starts, and then I kept going with the shark metaphor, and then I ended up choosing the Jaws poster for that chapter. So it was like a muse. It was that came to me via that book, and then I ended up with this Jaws artwork, which is I should have these tabs so I could just hold it up to the camera, but I'm sure everyone knows exactly what it is when I say the Jaws poster.
I know what the first movie looks like.
Yeah.
I know the first one.
Yeah. So there's the Jaws poster. But then the whole chapter ended up being this metaphor of me keeping swimming and ignoring all the red flags, the ones that tell you not to go in the water. And then I was able to do all this like lighthouse metaphors, and like the shark was there was so much in it, but it was like, it was like I was just following the breadcrumbs, and it led me to like probably I had the most fun writing that chapter because it just felt really organic. And then I started listening to the Jaws song, and that made its way in there too. It was like the theme song. But it's magic. It just like it can't be explained that like in a way that makes sense, I think, to people who haven't experienced it. It's just like it feels a little bit magical when it's happening.
But it's like when you learn to trust yourself. Like
Yes.
you get if you get a musician that's like that has to know the chart, has to know the key, but you've been doing it long enough that if you hear it, then you know what it is. And
Yes.
I know there are guys that like they ask for the chord chart, but they don't need it. They ask for the key, they don't need it. It's like, why don't you trust yourself? You've been doing this like 20 years, you know what it is. So it's like it's kind of like that there's a little they're like self-doubt. And it
Yes.
really doesn't need to be there. And it's self-deprecating. It's like, why are you doing that when you don't need to do that? Right? You
Yeah.
could just trust the fact that you do know it. So you
Yeah.
don't have to say, well, I'm not good enough. It kind of goes back to this idea you're not good enough, so you're like imposter syndrome. Like, why are you there? Like you don't believe you should be there. When well, you should be here. And I
Yeah.
think once you get past that and you can kind of get in touch with that muse and realize that yeah, you can have fun. Like it's not wrong. You don't have to be a tortured artist. That you can
Yeah.
actually have fun and be happy in it and not be frustrated and have anxiety and like you don't have to approach it that way.
Yeah. There were definitely times where like I did have to like re-feel a lot of the emotions of my whole life because it's like, well, I want to make sure I am able to describe this feeling I had. So then I had to actually feel it to be able to describe it. And so then I'm
Mm.
like stuck with in that feeling and I have to get out of it. But like still the process was so like it was hard. I had to go back to therapy just to like get through writing this book. But it still was like, yeah, it wasn't like a tortured experience. Like it was such a delightful experience to write it because I
Well, it's
and it
kind
felt
of
like it
like
was so true to me too.
it's kind of
Yeah.
like if you're a method actor. I mean, I think they love
Yeah.
being in that mode, but then they have to get out of it.
Yeah.
Right. So you get into that role, you live that person, you become that person, but then you have to kind of get out of it. But you
Yeah.
in the middle of it, you're kind of in a zone and you're like experiencing that zone. You love to do that, but like it's probably not healthy to stay in that character.
Yeah.
And I've heard there are artists that like they couldn't get out of the character. They had found it hard to, you know, pull themselves out of it.
Have you ever
So
read
that's always
Bryan
a whole
Cranston's
nother day.
memoir? Yeah. Have you ever read Bryan Cranston's memoir
No, I haven't.
on Breaking Bad?
No, I probably need to.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah,
all
I
you
probably
need to, I
need to
mean,
read that.
I haven't finished it because I'm reading it currently, but like the very first, like it's like I don't know if it's a prologue or introduction, but like the very first thing is he talks about like the most significant scene he shot in Breaking Bad, where I won't give away the full scope of it, but he basically like he did the scene and then he just like completely emotionally broke down because he was so in it, and then his like personal life kind of like infused its way into it too, and so like
Mhm.
he was just sobbing and like all the camera people and everybody was around like hugging him, and then he like went home and he was like it just like took him a really long time to get out of that. And I'm like, oh, that it made me really like just that little snippet of that prologue made me really respect the craft of actors so much for them to have to and writing this book too, like having to go back and feel all these things again. Because you
I
have to
think in
do it.
art, like a lot of artists, yeah, you do it in writing. You know, musicians do it because we play
Mhm.
characters. Like a lot of musicians, if you know, Bowie is like the biggest example, like Lady Gaga today. But Bowie
Yeah.
became like Ziggy Stardust. He became Aladdin Sane. He became the Thin White Duke. He would actually get into that role. And I heard like there's a story that when he was in Ziggy, he stayed in Ziggy on and off the stage for months. He didn't get
Wow.
out of it. And so he really took it very serious, like a method actor. He took theatrical, you know, capabilities. And a lot of musicians have realized, you know, in the 70s, you saw a lot of people like the Freddie Mercury's of the world. They took that the idea of theater
Yeah.
and being able to portray that other you, the other me, as part of the performance.
Yeah. That's amazing. And it's just amazing too that those are the things that like that we resonate with. Like when there is that emotion behind it, when there is that feeling, like that's that's the energy that we're connecting with. And it's amazing. I can see a painting in a museum and like Like, I know this was paint. There was no feeling in this. Like, here's a painting of cows. I'm like, oh, she was
Yeah.
probably just like painting cows. And, but it was like, it has like this, it just pushes off an energy that is just like draws you in.
Yeah. I mean,
So,
because when you're an artist, yeah, you kind of give of yourself. It's like the concept of Victorians. They had this idea of little death, right? So
mhm.
you die a little bit when you're putting into something that's creating something. So the
Oh,
act
I
of
like that sound.
creation is little death, and so the idea is that you do sacrifice part of yourself when you're giving these performances in your, whether you're a musician, a painter, or an actor, any type of artist. If they, when they really feel it, they have that kind of concept of that little death that Tennyson, Lord Byron, and a lot of the Victorians talked about. And I really resonate with a lot of the Victorians because they had so many layers to their work because
Yeah.
they're in the Victorian age. But there's a lot of truth in it. But there's a lot of hidden levels. But it was all, as being a songwriter, it's always very interesting. If you think about the songs of innocence and experience with Blake, he's probably the most simplistic of the writers of the Victorian era, but he could get to it with less words than Wordsworth or Tennyson.
Yeah.
That fearful symmetry of the tiger poem. His poems aren't very verbose, but they have that Victorian it's just that style
Yeah.
of
That's interesting though, because like
coded
he
words.
also was a visual artist. And so I'm like, I wonder if the fact that he was a visual artist played into the fact that he was able to capture those feelings with fewer words. Like he knew how to do that visually. And so there was
Yeah, because
something about his emotional understanding that he was able to like synthesize feeling in a
yeah, a lot of
certain
people
way.
don't realize that the songs of innocence and experience have plates that have
Mhm.
artwork that go to each one of them. Which I actually have a book that has all of them, has all the plates that go with the poems because I got really into
Yeah.
Blake. And that stuff is like, it is part of the reason I think like you did I think you put the nail on it. Those The visual aspect of his work is probably why it's not as verbose as like Tennyson, Wordsworth, and the rest of them, because it was part of a whole performance. It's the art
Mhm.
and the poem. But a lot of times
Yeah.
when you read about Blake, you never see the art. You just see the poem, and you're missing like half of the performance.
Yeah, it's funny because I'm like, oh, I always see the art, but not the poem because that's I'm always looking at the art stuff. But I love that because I had this experience when I was writing. It was like midway through the book, and I had this moment of the chapter was meant to be about like learning to feel my feelings and not like stuff them down. And
Mhm.
because I repressed all feeling for most of my life, even the good ones. Like all of them were not safe. And so I'm like learning to feel my feelings. But I was talking to my coach. And I was like, I don't have words to this. I was like, this is in my body. Like this is a feeling. It is an energy. It is a course of a couple of years of like experiencing life in a certain way. I was like, I don't know how to write this down. And then she that's
Mhm.
when she was like, very, very like compassionately and lovingly. She was like, well, what do you think about writing poems? And I like immediately like started to cry. And I was
Yeah.
like, it was like this moment of because I have books of poems from when I was a kid. I used to just constantly write poems, but I haven't since I was probably in high school. And so I just started to cry, and I was like, oh, that's right. That's exactly what it is.
Mhm.
That's how you capture a feeling with words. And I was just, but I was terrified because I was like, I haven't written a poem in 20 years. I wouldn't know how to write a poem. And but I knew she was right. And that this is where that muse came in again too. Because I was like, I knew she was right. I knew I had to do it. Once it was out in the world, I was like, there's no denying that that is the right thing to do in this situation. So I had to like really allow myself to write poems and be terrified doing it. I was like, people are gonna think I'm ridiculous. They're gonna roll their eyes at me. This poetry is gonna be so bad that everybody's gonna hate. It was like it was intense. But then I started to, and she was like, I didn't say that for any reason. She was like, I've read your work up to this
Mm.
point. She was like, you're writing poems, but you don't know it. So I went back into other chapters to like add poems back in, I was like, oh wait, there is a poem here. It's just a paragraph. And so I just put a couple enters, and I was like, oh, there we go. I was like, I have been writing
Yeah.
poems. I just didn't know it. But
Yeah.
it
Some
was
people
so
like they
scary.
write like the Iliad. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. You think about like a lot of times, people write and it might be like Homer or like the Iliad or the
Yeah.
Odyssey, and like and then they realize like, hey, really, I'm a songwriter or I'm a
Ah,
poet, and it is the probably purest way to get to your feeling, because at the
yeah.
moment it's probably it's kind of like this issue when you're a songwriter. We have all these takes, like when we're putting stuff down, and what we
Hmm.
always say is like if you have like 100 takes of a song, it's probably the first 4 or 5 that are closer to the truth.
Yeah.
Because when you
Yeah.
first put that down, that was what you were actually feeling. And then when you start to go back and pass over it, you start getting scared of those feelings. You start editing and taking stuff out.
Yeah.
And a lot of times the producers and editors will come in and say, you know what? That earlier version is the one that we should go with because it's closer to something real, and it might not be perfect, but it actually feels authentic. And that's where
Yeah.
having other people kind of like be your beta reader,
Yeah.
it kind of helps, artists because they'll go self-sabotage and get rid of all the good stuff.
Yeah, it's like when I put my book through Grammarly, like I was like kind of near the end and I'd already gone through it all, but I was like, oh, I'm just going to go put it through Grammarly to check for things. And I found that Grammarly kept wanting to take out my like lyricalness. And I was like, no, I was like, you're taking the like it was just trying to take out all the emotion of everything I was saying. So I was like, it did catch some commas and some, period problems or whatever it was. But like a lot of it, I was like, no, I chose that to say it that way because that's the way I felt,
Yeah,
and that like that there was a lot. I write with a lot of repetition, and so it was like kind of like a song. It was just like I'll say the same thing, but like we change one word multiple times, and it was just like you're using this word a lot. I'm like, I know, I meant to do that. So,
yeah, the
but
algorithms don't
yeah,
actually work with artists that well. Like if
yeah,
you're writing something that's like a research paper, or you're writing
yes,
something that's like a journalist piece of work, yeah, fine. But if you're an artist and you're trying to do something that's kind of creative, they don't know doesn't know how to deal with that. Maybe in the future with AI, it'll get better and recognize that, oh, this is an artist, this is a poet, this is a songwriter, this is not a research paper. You know,
yeah,
but like if right off the bat, it's thinking it's like a business paper. It's like
yeah,
it's a work paper for like a I don't know like a waterfall document for a
yeah.
programmer.
Yeah, I'm
Well,
working.
yeah,
We're
that's
artists.
probably
We
gonna be
don't we
more
don't do that.
precise. But
Yeah, there were settings that
yeah,
was like,
I
what's the
don't need
intent? It was like this. There was like describe. It was like it gave me some options, like describe. It was like, is it creative? Is it whatever? So I did get to choose that it was a creative piece of writing, but yeah, it still
yeah.
tried to
It
dull it
still
down a
tries to,
little.
yeah, it doesn't know because it's always repetitive. It's this and that. It's like, well, yeah, that's what
Hmm.
I'm trying to do.
Yeah, I'm
So
trying to
it's like,
slow the reader
well,
down and help them feel it, and like I don't want to take
yeah,
out words because then that's
you're not
you
trying to
know
make it. Well, sometimes artists like you're putting layers, right? You're
yeah,
putting layers, so it's not trying to be obvious. So,
yeah.
like, yeah, you could write it so it's more easily understood, but maybe that's not the point.
Hmm.
Like, it's like if you're trying to be like the Victorians, they're putting all these layers, or like the
Yeah.
looking glass. Well, why didn't you just say mirror? Like little death. What do you really mean? Yeah. Well, you don't really want to tell them what you you want them to
Yeah.
unpack it.
Yeah, you want it to be open for interpretation. And like I know that like when I wrote this, it's like yes, it's a memoir. Yes, it's about me and it's my story, but I want whoever's reading it to see themselves in it. And so that's really important. And so that vagueness that you need to include sometimes that like but you need the specificity too so that they know it's a real story and you're not just kind of talking in
Yeah, yeah,
generalities, but like it needs to be up for interpretation so that they can find their own story within mine. Um, that's what I
yeah.
try
It's
to
like
do anyway.
it sort of kind of draws the end. If you got that famous quote, is like, "Oh, the baby's shoes never worn." What does that mean?
Mm,
Then you start to unpack like what happened. You didn't
yeah,
tell them everything, but you can tell them later. You could draw them in. So the idea is that sometimes it's not going to be totally explicitly clear that you want it to have different paths that people could go down because then they can insert their own. And with the songwriters, it's the same way. We create stories. Some of it might be really about us, but you don't know. Maybe it isn't. But it's kind of a
Yeah.
universal truth, a universal idea like melancholy or loss or
Mm.
something. But you put it in such a way, is that really about the songwriter? Or is he really telling about somebody else? And a lot of times there's pieces like yourself, but in other cases, like there's stories about other people. Dylan is very famous for creating these characters in his songs,
Yeah.
and a
Well,
lot of
and
people say, "What's real?" Oh, that's really him, but you don't know. You ask
you don't
Dylan,
know.
sometimes he said, "Well, it wasn't me."
Yeah, Picasso said the same thing. He was like, "If it's me or is it not? I don't know. It's up to you." And a lot of people have, not a lot of people, but I've had people kind of come at me about my work that I shouldn't interpret art to the extent that I do, that I should have it be, I should be more about what the artist said and what the artist thought and what the artist felt, and we should really focus on what their experience rather than the viewer's experience. And I disagree with that because I'm like, the artist created it, but once they put it out in the world, it isn't it
Yeah,
changes. It's no longer
belongs
theirs.
to.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of artists will say that. You talk to musicians, it's like that song belongs to my fans. It belongs to the world,
Yeah.
right? So I put it out there, and well, what does it mean to you? Cause you could listen to something like, "Tangled Up in Blue" or "Idiot Wind" from Dylan, and you could say, "Well, that's about his divorce." But then if you put it into your like, you read it however you wanna read it, it's like, well, maybe it's not. Maybe it's about just, "Oh, there's all these people out there in the world, and they're kinda saying these things, and it's like, it's blown from here to the to the dam, to the it's like
Yeah.
he's just saying all these interesting stories and putting himself out in the woods. He's in the North Woods. He's there. He's there. He's traveling around. He's like, and what is it really about? This idiot win. Well, what is idiot win? Is
Yeah.
conversations. And then who are the conversations with politicians, with people? It's like microcosm, it's macrocosm. It's switching like focus. And they say, "Well, what is it really about that, or is it about however I interpret it to be?" And it belongs to the fan that listens to it and say, "Well, that's what it feels like to me today. Might feel like something else
Yes.
tomorrow."
Yeah, yeah, because I can look at the same artwork multiple times over the course of my life and have a completely different experience of it. Like, seeing Hamilton was probably the most dramatic of that for me because I see it anytime I can. Anytime I can. I've seen it 4 times, I think, at the theater, and every single time was a dramatically different experience. Like, the first time, I was in a kind of place in my business where I feel like nothing was working, and I was working so hard, but I couldn't make any headway. And like the Aaron Burr character like really stuck with me. It was like I understood what he was feeling. And so anytime he was on the stage, I was just sobbing. But then another time I saw it in Houston, and it was within a week of a school shooting that had happened within an hour from Houston. So it was like a week ago, an hour from where I'm sitting. Um, a bunch of kids died by gunfire, and then I'm on Hamilton. There's a kid that gets killed by gunfire, and so like it was just like really
Yeah,
devastating. And then another time I was like really happy, and like all the Scholar Sisters were like the best part. And so it's so funny, like the same thing. And the thing something I've seen before and I can quote verbatim, like hits me different no matter like what's happening in my life. And that's what's so cool about art. And if we only focus on what the artist wanted us to feel and what the artist wanted us to think, we're cutting off like so much richness and growth and self-development and self-realization and understanding of humanity and all the things that art is about.
yeah, because it's interesting with a lot of music. There's duality. Like I could have a
Yeah.
beat that's very funky and upbeat, but if you actually listen to the lyrics, there could be very melancholy, kind of down tempo.
Mm,
And that's kind of a trick, like in some new wave music, and even there's some examples like there where you actually have a very serious topic, but it's got such an infectious beat that people just hear the beat and they just hear the hook. But after you actually listen to the whole thing, it's not as obvious as it seems. To the point
yeah.
like where like a song like "Born in the USA" is about a guy, a Vietnam vet coming back, He's not declaring that
Yeah.
he's great, like, he's totally enamored to be a somebody born in the USA. He's kinda like, "I'm coming back, a long gone daddy of the USA." And some people took that song and they didn't understand its original intent, and they interpreted it to what they wanted it to be. And
Yeah.
it kinda shows, it's like, "Yeah, well, I wrote it to be this, but you interpret it to be that," but it's however you take it. Like, people don't
Yeah, it's
really,
like, who's right?
they perceive
Yeah.
it the way how they wanna perceive it.
Yeah. Um, that's a good example.
Yeah, it's
Art is
like
so
you never
good.
know how somebody's gonna take your work. You put it out there in the world,
Yeah.
and it's like, then I don't own it anymore. It's like, so
Yeah.
people always, like, misidentifying lyrics or not understanding what the original intent was. It's like, every breath you take is everybody saying, "Oh, that's a lovely love song," and Sting's like, "Well, that's a kinda dark song."
Yeah. And
When
it's
you ask him what
interesting.
he really intended.
Yeah. Oh, I had one, I have all
Yeah,
these
I mean,
artworks in my book, and like each artist, each image I had to get permission. So most of the art in my book is contemporary, so I had to like actually ask the actual artist. And I was like, "Can I use your? This is what I'm doing. This is what it's about." And
oh,
most of
that's
them,
cool.
all of them said yes, except for one. And she was like, "We only." Well, this was her agent or her gallery person, but they were like, she only allows her work to be shown in academic contexts. And I was like,
Oh, wow.
that's not what art is. I was like, no. I was like, she's my favorite artist. I'm not gonna name who it is, but like she literally is my
Yeah,
favorite artist. Her like artwork was on my lock screen on my phone for like 3 years. And it was the last chapter of the book. It was like the culminating thing, and I had to rewrite the whole thing. But I'm like, that's not what art is all about. And her artwork is so emotional, it's so human, and it's so relatable, and it's so bold, and it's so like everything. And I'm like, you're not allowing someone to like feel it. Um, like
yeah,
only
that's
academics.
interesting.
Yeah.
Sometimes, like, your idols can disappoint you,
Yeah.
sometimes, like, 'cause I remember that, like, Bob Dylan had this interview with Martin Scorsese, and they were asking him about his, like, protest music era when he was, like, a folk and he was doing, like, all these songs
Mhm.
about, like, civil rights, and he seemed to wanna walk away from it. Like, when they tried to pin him on it, he's like, "Well,
Mm.
those are just songs." I'm not he didn't really wanna own it. And then people were like, "Wow," it's like, people really looked up to you for these songs, and now you really don't wanna identify with that period of your life at all, and I guess that's where his head was at. It's like, "I'm not there." And that's an example, like, when you're 20 something years old and you write that, that's what you're feeling at that moment. But now that you're, like,
Yeah.
67 or 70, I don't feel that way. So now he's kinda like, "Well, I don't feel that way today, so I'm not gonna own it."
Oh,
So I'm
that's
not gonna put
fascinating.
myself in that space. Yeah, so I was like, "Wow," that was really, because there's a whole generation of people that like, "Wow," Dylan was on this and he's doing this, and he did Hurricane, he did all these songs. It's like now he's saying, "Oh, I don't really mean that." It's like, "Oh, you don't?" Well,
Oh, I mean,
okay.
huh. I could say I don't mean I like if I were to be judged by something I did when I was 23, like, oh, that's not good. But like
Yeah.
this stuff is iconic, so it's a little bit different. Oh,
Yeah, it's kinda
yeah.
just hard to live up to what you created, and maybe
Yeah.
he felt, it seemed like he was felt uncomfortable, oh, saying like, "I'm that same person. I'm not at that time when I wrote it, that's where I was, but I'm
Yeah.
not there now." So like he
Hmm.
didn't want to get pinned into it. I can get it because like that's if you're 17-year-olds when you're 21, 22 years old, you create this art, and then like you're different. You're not the same person,
Yeah.
and people probably want you to be, but you're
Yeah.
not. And so that's kinda hard to deal with. It's like he was, like, drawing lines, he's creating boundaries. I sometimes you have to create boundaries, and that's his boundary. It's like, he didn't wanna deal with it. So I was like, "Okay, that's
Yeah.
him."
He wants to talk about who he is now, what he's doing now, what he cares about now. Doesn't want to talk
Yeah.
about who he was 20 years ago. Yeah, I do. It does show his humanity and that he's not, it's things we all deal with, I suppose.
Yeah, I think you just as an artist, you have to have boundaries sometimes, and the thing is,
Mhm.
it's hard because when you're an artist, you have vulnerability,
Yeah.
and the vulnerability usually creates your best work, but then you're kinda, "Well, how do I deal with this out in public?" Like, I'm showing this. It's very raw. It's
Yeah.
really it can be painful. And then you're like, well, how do I handle the result of what I put into the world? When
Yeah.
people start to ask me questions about it.
Especially because like we're vulnerability is not a trait that is very well accepted in the world for a lot of people. And so the ones that are vulnerable, like it's so scary. And I know now, like I just released this last week and I am starting to like come across people who have read it. But now I'm just like, oh gosh, who in my life has read it? Who hasn't read it? What are they thinking about? There's like this whole thing. And I'm
Yeah.
like, I wrote it, I put it out there. I'm gonna have to deal with it. But it is it is scary to know, like, I don't know what they're thinking of me, but it's okay because I feel really good about what I wrote, and I think it will help a lot of people, and I just have to get over myself a little bit and my fear of judgment, I guess.
Well, I think a lot of art is like it takes the layers of trauma that we have.
Yeah.
And the thing about being a creative is we find a way to turn that into a piece of work. And then
Yes.
then then we have to kind of deal with it and come to terms with like I did create this. And
Yeah.
it puts you out there and there're gonna be people that don't like it. And there are gonna be people that do like it. So it's like the law of attraction. It's like, do you care more about the people that come to you and the opportunities that happen, or the couple of people that said they didn't like it? Or did
Yeah.
you kind of have to go with like, okay, it's out there and I'm just gonna deal as it comes and not obsess about like, okay, well, they hated it. And like, well, yeah, well, these
Yeah.
people loved it. So like, is it the one critic hates it, that well, that's gonna put you all the way down? Or are you gonna say, that's him, that's them? Like not
Yeah.
everybody's gonna love what you do. That's just the way it is.
It's like that Theodore Roosevelt quote that's like, I can't quote it exactly. It's in my book somewhere actually, but it's like, don't take judgment from those who are not in the ring with you, like because they didn't put themselves out there. They don't know what it's like to do what you've done. So I just have to keep remembering that. that
Yeah. That's
yeah.
that's just a fact. There's so many people out there, professional, journalists that critique artists, and I think Prince was really into that. It's like I'm gonna listen to a guy who can't, I can play 27 instruments. This guy writes, and that's fine, but he doesn't isn't in my world. So I take it
Yeah.
or leave it. Like I deal with my creations as they are. Like, he felt like they were his children, and he created them. It's like they're out there, and that's
Hmm.
what I created at the moment. And I was very happy with it at the time I created it. Like, either it's gonna be as big as Purple Rain or it's not. But I'm not trying to recreate Purple Rain every night. That's
Yeah.
not what I want to do. And you have to realize sometimes you have a zenith as an artist, and yeah, no one's ever gonna ever connect with you like that moment. But it doesn't mean you can't have other moments.
Yeah. And I think too, then that like the creator has that desire, like that need to create and to put themselves out there and to make something new out of nothing doesn't go away once you have a success. Like that, the goal isn't to have a successful work of art, or it's like I mean, I guess it is like it is a goal. You're like, yeah, I want the money from like if this became a like New York Times bestseller, I would be delighted. But I'm whether if it does or it doesn't, I'm still going to write the next one. I still have the next one
Yeah,
ready to write, and I know what I'm going to write because I feel like I have to. Like it's
your
like this
purpose. Yeah,
this drive.
like, is
Yeah.
your it's like I was talking to a guy yesterday on a podcast. It's like, what is your purpose? Right? Are you doing it to do for you or for someone else? Or like, why are you doing this? Like you have to ask yourself, like, 'cause I dealt with a lot of kids when I was 17 that were musicians, and that most of them stopped because they really didn't love what they were doing. They had a different
Yeah.
goal. Their goal was to
Yeah.
do, this is going to get me this. This is going to get me that. I did the music because I love it. So I still play
Yeah.
17 to 56. I play because I love to play. If people like it, that's fine. If they don't,
Yeah.
that's fine. I'm still going
It's
to play my piano tomorrow because I like to
yeah.
play.
It's still like it's like that. I told you I was kind of writing two books at once. And that's what it felt like. It was like that first half that I ended up cutting was written for the wrong purpose. It wasn't written to make art. It was written to maybe to sell or to like be palatable or whatever. And like you can tell the difference between a book that was written because the writer had the mission and the purpose and it felt like they had to write it versus one who wrote it so that they could advance their business or so that or so they could just sell more books or like there you can tell the difference
Yeah.
in that and in
What's
music
gonna
and art
trigger
and anything.
Yeah, what triggers a billion views on the Spotify algorithm
Yeah,
versus what is actually in your heart? Where,
exactly.
like, I'll go listen to, like, a Neil Young song for, like a deep track, and it wasn't as big as any of the big things he did with Crosby, Stills, or Nash, or Buffalo Springfield, but that's a gem. It's a gem to me.
Hmm.
And it's like, it doesn't just because it didn't get a billion views or a billion listens doesn't mean it's not good. That's the problem with a lot of people today with all the social media. Like, it's got to get so many views to be legitimate. Like, that's not what art is.
Yeah, it's
Art
not.
is like, it is what it's, you put it out in the world, and sometimes the deepest things or the hidden gems, they never got the light of day, but they're great pieces of work. And it's like the idea of the album that you could have this
Yeah.
piece, and then inside of it, there's non-singles, but those actually tell you who the artist is. Like, if you're a writer, like, the deeper you get, it's not the cliff note, it's the deep
Hmm.
part of the structure of the book. I mean, it's the deep insides of that book. It's not just the summary of the
Yeah.
protagonist and the whole outcome. Is like, it's a journey.
Yeah, it's that
And, like, in
layeredness
that
that you were
journey, there are
talking about.
moments it might not be as bombastic. Yeah, it's not
Yeah.
bombastic every day. Not everything's gonna be the big thing. It's like you have to build to where you're gonna get to it. You gotta read through it.
Yeah. Well, just like any piece of art or any piece of music, you have to have contrast. You have to have the highs and lows. You can't stay at one level, then it gets to be too much. There's a rhythm that like in a book too, it's like I had some really emotional things and I was like writing the next chapter and I was like, I don't feel like this chapter is as good as the chapter before it. But my book coach was like, it needs to not be because that one was so emotional. You need to give them a little bit of a break and it's like you need to kind of rest and recover from
Yeah,
that
it's
before you
ebb
build
and
up to
flow.
something
It's like a
else.
wave.
Yeah.
It's like the wave.
Yeah.
It's like in sound waves. Like, I deal with sound waves. I do sound design. I
Mm,
deal with, like, sine
yeah.
waves, ramp waves, square waves, and I kinda know what they're gonna do. Like, certain waveforms will actually, trigger into, like, rhythm forms. So you have the melodic forms and harmonics and dissonance. And in a song, you have things that are melodic, and then you have things that are like dissonance and noise
Yeah.
and not melodic. It gives you that contrast. It's the same kind of contrast that you put in your book. Like, when we do a song, there's some parts of that song that aren't perfect. They're kind of there to contrast with the other parts that kind of bring focus. So you focus on this part, and then you less focus on that, and your ear hears this, and your ear doesn't hear that. And that's the whole structure of the piece of art.
Hmm.
Is like, it's not always the chorus. And some people just want a song that's all chorus. It's just all beat.
Yeah.
There's no intro, there's no outro, there's no alternative structure. And like, people are like, well, what is
Mm,
that? It's just trying to hit an algorithm because you're hitting, there's nothing but the hook for the whole thing. It's like, what is
yeah.
that?
I guess for a dance club or something. I don't know.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it's like, that's kind of what some people think of, that's what you should do. And I was like, well, that's not exactly a song structure.
No. Yeah. So it's telling a story and it's taking the listener on a journey and you need any story needs highs and lows and all of that. It's like any artwork.
Yeah, it's just the
Yeah.
layers that you find to build your work, and then how you tie that to your life, and I think a lot of art is like, you take the things that happen to you, and you tell that story. We're storytellers.
Hmm.
That's what we do with the podcast. We try to have
Yeah.
people tell their story. And you were able to work out, from what you've told me, like, you had the 2 books, and then you found, like, the true book inside the book, and
Yeah.
that became, like, the real purpose.
Yeah. And if you would have asked me, like, it, I could have never predicted that this would have come out when I started. I mean, but it is because I allowed the process to unfold and I followed my muse and all of that. Like, it is the most true and beautiful version of this book that could ever exist because I allowed that to happen. But I couldn't have predicted this in a million years. What ended
That's the
up
great thing
being
about art.
written.
It's kind of
Yeah.
it's kind of point in time at the time you're doing that creation. Is
Yeah.
like you can plan out as much as you can. You can like I've talked to novelists that do the world building and
Oh
they
yeah.
do the character design and it's very structured, but then they do admit that a lot of the stuff was flow state. They had stuff that came at the last minute and it gave them new ideas that they did not have in the roadmap. That it
Yeah.
just they just came out of a dream or it's like this muse moment and they got kind of in a trance. Like a musician, sometimes if you ask us, we were on stage, it's like, what happened in the last hour? It's like, I don't know. I just
No
got in the
idea.
zone. It's
Yep.
kind of like if you're in that zone, it's just like I felt the room, I felt the audience, I felt and it just happened. And whether I can repeat that, well, it's not going to be repeatable. It's kind of like that moment was what it was. There'll be a
Yeah.
different moment, but like that is what it is, and you capture it. When you do a live performance. But it's like that's kind of what art is to me. It's like that live performance kind of flow state.
Yeah, I think that's like the state I've been chasing my whole life. It's like once you know it exists and you know it's possible, it's like, oh, I want that. I want more of that. And I'll put up with, a whole year of not having that happen for it to happen one time. It's like it's worth like
Yeah,
all the time of it not happening. Uh,
yeah. It
so
doesn't always happen. A lot of times you have to have like a quiet. What I've talked to a lot of
mm,
artists, like you kind of got to give
yes.
yourself that quiet because so much noise. And you're thinking like, well, if I go into fairly frenetic and I'm trying to overplan, it's like with too much noise. It's like you just
Yep.
go and you kind of get into a quiet space, you meditate, or you just try to like turn things off, and then things will kind of channel through you. And it doesn't
Yep.
happen every day that you get that thing that channels through and it creates that great piece of work. But like the thing is, I think artists, we know when it comes. We're
Hmm.
kind of receivers, and we can receive that comes, and we have the ability to kind of not throw it away and actually
Yeah.
jump on it when it actually comes. And that train doesn't come every day, but you jump on it when it does.
Yeah. I love that. Mine is usually at 4 a.m. Like, I'll just wake up and I'll be like, "I know exactly what to do." So then I'm like, "Okay, I guess I have to get up now because 'cause I'm not gonna remember it tomorrow," and I'm like, "Gotta capitalize on this." My next book idea came at 4 a.m. and I got up and, like, drafted the, like, whole outline, for the next 2 hours, but it was just I woke up and it was there, and I just had to follow it. So,
It's good to give
love it.
yourself that safe space where you feel that you can do that. Like a lot of
Yeah.
us producers, we have our bedroom studios, like the one I'm in, because it's like, yeah, if I get a dream idea and I wake up, I can just jump on my board, hit the record,
Yeah.
put it down, and nobody hears it. It's in my headphones, and it's down. And it's like sometimes it just happens. We use voice recorders, we write on napkins,
Mhm.
you know, we have a lot of tools today, but when it comes, it's like, yeah, I don't know when it's gonna come, but I just put it down.
Yeah, and I don't trust that I'm gonna remember it, so, yeah, I use voice memos a lot if I'm driving or whatever. I'm like, I need to write this down." So, voice memos. I don't know what people did before that. I guess, I don't know, pulled over in
Napkins.
their car and wrote it down. Yeah.
They
Carried
just
a
stop
notebook
and have
around.
the journals. Like I know a lot
Yeah.
of artists in the '70s, they had these journals and they
Oh,
just
yeah.
write everything down. And they were just writing all the time in these notebooks and notepads. And like, I was looking at like Morrison's notepads and Hendrix's notepads. It's like
Yeah.
there's all these notes furiously written all everywhere. The backs of things, backs of letters, just writing all this stuff down. I'm like, okay, I can see their mind. That kind of art mind's like, I got an idea. I'm just gonna put it down.
Yeah. Love it.
But yeah, thank you again for being on the show. And I mentioned your
Yeah.
website,
Thank
which is
you.
their book. It's
Yep.
art is about being whole.com. So if people go to that, they can actually purchase the book.
Yeah, they can get a link to go to the book, or you can just type in "Art is About Being Whole." It's on Amazon and Barnes& and Noble and those sort of places. But yeah, it's a great labor of love. And I really loved talking art philosophy with you today. That's my favorite stuff to talk about. So that was a delight.
Well, thank you very much. I want people to check that out. We do encourage people to click the links. They're fully clickable. When we're published, we're on all the major podcast platforms where you listen or watch. So by tomorrow, they'll be there. We're live on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitch right now. That link will be fully clickable as soon as we're off the air. And thank you again for being on the show. And we do encourage people to check out your book. Based on the discussion, it sounds like a very interesting read. I do encourage people to check it out.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me on too.
Thank you. Have a good night.
You too.